Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? The distant shapes in the back, can everybody hear me? I was going to let the Steely Dan keep going, but I figured probably start the presentation. So my talk today is called Running with Wireframes, Taking Information Architecture into Design. So can I have a show of hands who considers themselves an information architect or a user experience professional? Okay. How about a graphic designer? Or a visual designer? Okay. How about both? Okay. What about a content strategist? Okay, cool. Well, my guess is that all of these disciplines, you've probably all had issues at some time communicating with the other side of the other department during the design process. So my talk is concerned specifically with the handoff and the transition between information architecture and design, and how we get from the wireframing phase into a full visual design process. And specifically, it's about how to enable a good design with good wireframing and IA practice and process. It's for helping IA and UX designers learn to work better and more clearly with graphic designers. I'm a graphic designer, and recently I've had quite a bit of experience working with IA professionals, and I just kind of wanted to share some things that have helped me a lot in this process. So it's about help. And even more than that, it's about building a repeatable process. Because one of the things you learn when you do design long enough is that it's really frustrating to do work that you can't repeat. You feel like you're constantly bumping your head in front of a wall, and you can't move forward with the process. So it's about learning how to take this IA design handoff and make it repeatable so we can all do the best work we can. But really, it's about building a solid design process, one that respects information architecture and design equally and helps produce the best work we can. So a couple things I want to talk about. My view of design is that really all these disciplines encompass design. I know this isn't a novel thought, but I think it's really important to point out that a lot of the walls we set up between disciplines aren't necessarily walls that need to be there, and that the best work comes from an open process between content strategy, information architecture, and design. And again, it's about being open and flexible to listening to the sides of the other discipline. And once again, it's about being repeatable and being able to take this stuff, this workflow that you have, and do it over and over again and get better at it, so that the work you can do, you can depend on, and you don't have to worry about constantly reevaluating your process and constantly having to work through frustration and team disagreement. But there are a couple of things you won't learn today, so I just want to let you know. I'm not going to discuss any technologies, no C#, no .NET. I probably won't talk really about like OmniGraffle or Visio or anything really kind of work practical like that. But I am going to talk really primarily about process, about how we engage each other and how we come up with the best design we can. Anyway, I promise not to be too boring. There are a lot of pretty pictures. I found this in my hotel room last night. I'm up against a friendly guy with a puppet, so I'm feeling a little overshadowed today. I have no puppets, and I have no likeness to Ricky Gervais. In case you didn't know, he looks just like him. So kind of freaked me out. I don't know. I like The Office, and I saw that, and it doesn't look like Kermit, but it's some doppelganger. So anyway. So hello. I'm Matt Brown. I run a web design studio in Seattle called Things That Are Brown. I do design and site development, and I work with my wife. And we've been doing this or I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and we just started working together recently. So I started, like most of you, back in the day, learning how to design on the internet from the internet. So I actually learned how to do HTML and CSS through a Windows 3.1 help file. I don't know if anybody remembers those, but it's a hilarious way to learn. It was kind of a proto-hypertext thing. So I really actually didn't learn through the internet. I learned through a Windows help file. But this design on the back, the computer's buyer guide, that kind of came out of my unhealthy fascination with service merchandise catalogs and knowing the prices of everything. I was kind of a pack rat as a kid, and I could tell you the price for every Timex watch in 1988, probably off the top of my head. So that kind of came out of that fascination. Windows 95 hotkeys, just an excuse to use an awesome font. and I kind of built the design around that. So after that, I have some work experience. Before I went freelance, I worked for a number of companies. Catalyst, a real estate software company in Chicago. They do they build a web application that does commercial real estate listing. So they're kind of like a Zillow for the commercial real estate space. I worked for LTTS. They're a technology studio in the education space. That's at Indiana University. And I worked briefly at SEO Moz, an SEO company in Seattle, right when I moved out there. And in all those roles, I held I wore all hats. I was the designer, the front-end engineer, in a lot of cases, the liaison between the marketing department, content writing, just the nature of small business. You have to kind of juggle a lot of things. So I started to really appreciate when I could hit a good process. And I found it frustrating because on my own, I wasn't able to really focus on these process issues. So after that, I made the jump to freelance in 2008. And this is my best friend. He rendered that for me. It didn't look like that all the time, but some days were better than others. But I did that for about 2 years, and it was really liberating for me because I had been working in the product space for so long that I really didn't have a lot of the freedom to experiment with my designs. So I learned a lot in a very short time. In the first 4 months, I designed and developed about 6 sites, which was, I think, more than I had even touched in the last 2 years, working at a company. And it's just a different type of work. It was really exciting. But I knew that I had to work on process even more. But now, to kind of take you up to speed, today I work with my wife, Tiffany. Things are a lot cleaner now. I handle design and site development, and she handles content strategy, web writing, and project management. And as you can see, it's a much better process already because it's vector and not a line drawing. So recently I completed a couple of projects for Microsoft, and I know that has anybody seen the Najant's panel earlier, the Anatomy of Web Process, a couple people. He kind of outlined, I think, a lot of things I'm going to touch on today, but we both worked together, Tiffany and I, with Microsoft to build a series of sites for the MIX community. And the most important one is MIX, the one in the background. That was a community site that we were engaged with to kind of rebrand and reposition. So I worked with Nishant, and Nishant actually handled the IA phase, and I handled just the visual design phase. So I'm going to kind of work that into the presentation and explain how that process informed my opinions of the IA to design transfer. So really quickly, I'm sure everybody here knows what a wireframe is, but I think we should just define the terms. So I like this definition a lot, and I'm actually cribbing it from Nishant. A wireframe is a visualization tool for presenting proposed functions, structure, and content of a web page or website. It's a little dry, but I think that makes very good sense. It's proposing functions, it's outlining a structure, and making sure that all the content requirements are put on the page. And this is roughly what a wireframe looks like. They're usually grayscale. They're usually not too styled. They don't have a lot of texture to them. In fact, most wireframes wouldn't have that kind of awesome clip art in the middle of them because it's kind of distracting. It may just be a box that's outlined. But I like the way it looks, so I put it up there. Sorry to distract everybody. But that's kind of what wireframes look like. To put it another way, I think they're a blueprint for what's required. I like to look at them as at their core requirement docs, trying to understand what a site needs to be successful. But at the end of the day, though, they're just a document. And I think this sometimes gets lost in the discussion about wireframes and sometimes in the process. People get a little too fixated on the wireframing phase, as it stands apart from the full design cycle. So I like to think of them as just a document. It's just a disposable document meant to facilitate a larger process. So I don't like getting hung up on these, and I don't like pushing them too much to clients. I like using them as part of a kind of seamless flow for the rest of the site. So here's my idea of the creative process. We have the cone of creativity and the ideas coming in to the top. And the process is really a process of thinning out. So I think all creative processes start broadly, or should. So things happen in the beginning of the process. It's a lot of meetings and discovery and finding out what the requirements of the project are with your client or with your internal stakeholder. And once you've kind of defined that, the process starts narrowing. And when I think the process starts narrowing is when wireframes come in. After you've had this interview process, you can start really laying the groundwork of what the site is going to be. So wireframes really help shape what the end site is. So I think they're vital. In a lot of ways, information architecture is much more important than design or than the visual design phase, because it's really outlining what the site will become. So, but to put it another way, I still think they're just part of the process. Clients don't take wireframes and hang them on their walls. At least I would find it weird if they did, and I wouldn't want them to, because my wireframes aren't that good looking. So, anyhow, I think one thing we have to talk about before we go any further is this concept of fidelity. Fidelity in a wireframe. So what does it mean? And I think what it means for the design process is really instructive, because it's how designers interpret your work. The texture and the tone of the actual wireframe design, I think, influence how designers treat it. If it's very sketched out and kind of low fidelity, in my experience, I don't treat those wireframes as very serious. Not that I don't treat them with respect, but I just don't think that they're finalized wireframes. If I was past a really high fidelity comp where everything was broken in, I'd feel really leery to make radical changes. So it's really important to think of fidelity as the kind of speaking voice that you're talking to designers with. So for all the information architects, I think knowing and leveraging what type of fidelity you use at what point is really important. So we'll start out with the boombox, lo-fi. And this round is usually done with a pencil. It's sketching things out over a conference table, over a bar in a napkin sketch, whatever. But it's just trying to get these ideas out and in a conversational manner where people can really start talking about their ideas. So this is one example of what a low-fidelity wireframe looks like. And now this one is not drawn by hand. It's actually kind of faked by a vector program that kind of fakes that textured line. I'm not a huge fan of this type of wireframe, but I think it's functional in the sense that it's a PDF and you can share it easily. This was done by a friend of mine, and it does a really good job of breaking up the core elements. It establishes the navigation that the client required. It establishes the main functions the client wanted on their site. And it gives a very kind of skeletal feel of the site. So lo-fi wireframes have a lot of positives. As we mentioned before, they're easy to create. You can do it over drinks. You can do it over a conference table. And they're easy to discuss because people are involved in the process. If you engage people in creating lo-fi wireframes, you can get some of your best ideas. It doesn't just have to be the information architect actually sketching things out. You can get Bob from marketing or whatever to kind of help out with that process. It also gives designers a lot of freedom. That's one thing that I think we don't talk about enough is how wireframes influence how designers treat the process. So when you have a low-fidelity wireframe, as I mentioned earlier, you feel like you can take a lot of liberties with this. So it's good to have that freedom, but only in certain ways. So the cons of a low-fidelity wireframe sometimes is that they're hard to read. They can be vague. And it's largely because of what I just mentioned. Because they give so much freedom to the designer, it's hard to really interpret what elements are committed to and what elements aren't. So they're really good to get ideas out and use as a discussion tool, but they're hard to use in part of a process moving forward because as a designer, you never know what you can trust and what you can lean on. And you don't want to kind of do work that's going to get overrun because I didn't interpret that low-fidelity wireframe. So I usually don't like making decisions based on these low-fidelity wireframes as a designer. I think they're vital to the process, but I don't think they're something that is easy to roll with. So functional fidelity wireframe, we're moving up in the hi-fi family tree. I like to think of these as like the Toyota of wireframes. They're functional, they do everything pretty well, but they look kind of boring. But that's the point. So again, one of Nishant's wireframes. It's very simple, using grayscale. Again, also highlighting navigation elements, highlighting all the content requirements. You see that this one is going a little bit further than the one that I showed you earlier. It's actually scoping out some font issues, some affordance. Some fonts are larger than others. Some fonts are more prominent than others, and they're organized better than others. And also, we're starting to see kind of the shape and size of graphic elements. It's hard to see on the screen, but there are avatar boxes on the left that are being scoped out. And that's something that really wasn't seen in the low-fidelity wireframe. You may just kind of sketch those things in, but this is kind of starting to give a shape to the thing. So again, some of the positives are these aren't hard to create either. If you're good with Visio or OmniGraffle, these things can take an hour to create, half an hour to create. All depends on kind of what project you're working on. And they start to set layout options. And layout options can be really helpful for a designer. Sometimes it's really, really exciting for me to just see, OK, this is a possibility. We can go with a column here and a split here. And that really helps set my expectation for something I can move forward with and lean on. And they're balanced. They balance the idea of creativity with the idea of structure. So you can. It's a good balance between being too creative or being too open-ended and too locked down, as we'll see later with high-fidelity wireframes. So some of the negatives is they need a lot of preface. This is something I'm going to get into later because these wireframes actually did a great job of that. But when you have a wireframe like, I'm going to go back up. When you have a wireframe like this, it's sometimes hard to know what elements are solid and what elements aren't. We know that the content's here, but we don't necessarily know if those avatars have to be square. And that ends up influencing my design choices. So if I start making something 3x2, or if I start making something 16x9, that might really actually be a functional problem. So I think a lot of times the problem with wireframes like this, and these I think are typical of most wireframes, is that you really have to have a really thorough discussion with the information architect to know what elements are up for discussion and modification and which elements aren't. Just looking at a PDF is always kind of a recipe for disaster. So now we're moving on to hi-fi wireframes. And it's not a very good-looking hi-fi, but it was good enough. So this is actually an interesting wireframe in the sense that it's really a little bit more than a high-fidelity comp. It's almost a low-fidelity visual design. This is done by Jesse Bennett Chamberlain, a designer I really respect. But I've done a lot of these. I find these helpful after I do sketches. I tend to jump into these rather than going to that intermediate step because I just kind of work a little bit freer in Photoshop than I do in a wireframing tool. But there are a lot of problems with these wireframes, as well as a handful of positives. So some of the things that these do well is they present a complete IA solution. Everything is locked in. Everything is scoped. And they're representative of usually the tail end of a design process. So you can usually make a lot of really good bets on what these wireframes are going to do for you. They also communicate basic design. If you look at the wireframe that Jesse has, he's starting to make font choices. He's starting to make stylistic choices with the navigation on the left side, things that are a little bit less typical. And also really fairly detailed with the shadows. So you're starting to see this design take shape. And that can actually, in a lot of cases, be helpful as a designer if you want to get rolling. And it's also very easy for the client to see this design. Some of the problems that you have with low-fidelity wireframes is clients don't really know what to make of them. And I'm sure that there's nothing more painful than having to discuss that your site will not look like a crayon mock-up when you deliver it to them. And I've had those conversations. It's painful. So some people actually need this sort of level of polish to really have a good discussion about what's going on. So there are a lot of cons to these, though. As I said, they're costly to create. It can be difficult to change, and it limits your design inputs. So changes are expensive because you've already scoped in design choices. And that can make things really painful if you have to revert away from a shadow style, move fonts over one way, or change from a serif to a sans serif. It just makes the whole process a lot less fluid. So it's best to only save high-fidelity wireframes when they're needed. And I really like using them only at the end of a process or when they're needed because the client can't really see a low-fidelity wireframe for what it is. So what style to use and when? It's not really that type of a question. It really depends on when this fidelity is required in the process. So, and it's also in terms of the size of the project actually has a huge impact on this. For a smaller project like a restaurant website, you may be able to go from a low-fidelity wireframe straight into design. But on larger projects, you'd want to go for the full process. But in general, the process works like the flipped creativity cone. So you're using a time vector from start to end. and you're taking things from low fidelity to high fidelity. So as the project starts, we want to start broad, we want to start fun and creative, just kind of screw around and really get as many good ideas on the wall as we can. And then as we move forward, we start shaping that into a solid wireframe. And that wireframing phase usually goes through a couple iterations, and the fidelity of it gradually increases. At the end, you might not have a high fidelity wireframe, you may go straight into design, but you'll likely have a couple iterations where the fidelity of it does increase as you move forward in the process. Okay, so that's kind of the groundwork of what wireframes are. But principles of a good wireframe process. I think these are kind of the high-level concerns of how we talk about wireframing. And to some people, these may be obvious, but I've kind of really seen these as very core to how you establish a good relationship with designers and how you stay open and flexible to the process. So the easiest thing to do is to engage designers early. You don't want to leave them in the dark. You don't want to start a wireframing process, get to the end, and then pass off a wireframe where they have no context for the decisions that have kind of led up to that wireframe comp. And I see this a lot in freelance. A lot of times I'm working with other teams who may provide me information architecture documents that I haven't really seen the whole process. I haven't seen iterations. I haven't been involved in the discussions. So I'm really seeing just a PDF with some boxes on it. It can be really frustrating. So you want to engage them earlier. And you want to show them your iterations, explain your iterations, and involve them in the meetings and discussions and whiteboard together. It's just very important because in many cases, having the information architecture and the design team talking together results in much stronger work and much greater collaboration. But it's important that you don't flirt with the designer and the IA because the content strategy guy is left totally out of the loop and like really sad because that's not fun. He's just looking at the wireframes and they're looking at each other. I admire his focus though. That's the best part because that's like pretty steamy. Anyway, again, engaging content strategists. You want to engage content strategy, and I'll get into this later in the talk because content strategy and information architecture, I think, are starting to merge. You're starting to see a lot of overlap between the way people talk about content strategy and what they're doing in that process and what information architects are doing in theirs. So I think one of the best things, if you have a content strategist on your team, as an information architect, you should engage them as early as possible because they are going to define the what of the elements you're organizing. So as you're moving things around on the page and setting up grids and setting up layouts and affordance, what you're actually moving around, the actual details of that content, are vitally important. And we'll kind of explore that a little bit later as we talk about this in greater detail. Just wanted to use some clip art. We're all part of the same team, so it's very important that we need to respect each other's process. One of the worst things to do is to set up a wall where you set up a very structured system that kind of limits other people from coming into this collaborative process. So if we're all part of the same team, we do better work. And again, we see a lot of overlap. And IA really is kind of at the center of these two disciplines. It's bridging content strategy and design. So in a lot of ways, it's a very hard position because you have to really think about the what of what you're doing and how that work is going to inform the art direction, tone, and visual style of the site once it's done. So here's the meat of the talk. This is practical advice for the information architect. And these are things I've kind of come up with as I've worked with a handful of information architects through my freelance career. So these are just things I feel like, as a designer, work really well for me and really help me get engaged in the interaction design phase of things and make sure that my designs don't end up wasted. So here we go. So I think context with any wireframing phase is absolutely vital. You really can't just present a wireframe to a designer and have them roll with it. I used to think you could. I mean, I used to take wireframes and just like kind of rip them out of the hands and then just like run with them, open up Photoshop and start making everything look awesome. But it really doesn't work that way because there's much more that goes into a wireframe than just the actual visual image you get. It's the discussions that have gone behind it and the reasons for why those things are. And also, the fidelity impacts it because you may make choices that the information architecture specifically didn't want you to do. So it's very important to think about context. So this is a cover letter that Nishant put in his wireframes that I think is super important. It was very vital to our process because it helped me understand how to work with his wireframes. And I'd never seen anything like this before. Typically, when I get wireframes, I have a cover sheet with some, very basic explanation, or it might be tacked onto an email. But this was bolted on in the front page of a PDF. And it made me address it. Every time I opened up that PDF, this was the first thing I had to look at. And I don't want to bore you with the details of reading the entire thing, but he kind of goes into this, and I'll just read that first sentence. Is, while these wireframes look and feel like typical wireframes, there's one fundamental difference between the two. Functional wireframes simply assert that information will be displayed on any given page and nothing more. So he's defining, they do not guarantee information with regards to layout and positioning of information. So he's explicitly letting me know that layout hasn't been locked down, that's still in my domain. And it may seem innocuous, but for me it was really revelatory because I got to think, okay, he wants me to really tackle the layout. And even though these wireframes do show layout, it's still open and on the table for discussion. And there's this color code system that we'll get into later that kind of helped me understand the strength of his commitment to these different designs. So they provide a clear memo on how to interpret and use your work. So if you're an information architect, consider this the next time you send wireframes to a designer. You want to give them as much context for the work you've done and as much explanation, and make it clear and concise like this because it will really help them kind of know how to balance their work against yours. So in this cover letter, it's important, again, to give priority, which we'll talk about later, between the different designs. To note dates, when it was updated, how many times it's been modified is a good thing, but also list contact information. A lot of times PDFs get kind of replied to all or replied to somebody somewhere else and then passed back. The cycle of a PDF is kind of scary sometimes. So it's very important to make sure that this information is actually attached to the PDF. It really makes a big difference. And so that's one thing. And moving forward, this is really simple. But I've had a handful of wireframes where I haven't had a sitemap. And being a visual person, I don't think these things have to be perfect. I don't think they have to be very extreme. But a very high-level explanation of how these pages fit together is very exciting as a designer to see that mapped out. And what's really exciting about this, and not exciting in this is just very helpful. So because wireframes aren't that exciting, But anyway, I would print this out and put it on my wall. So while I'm working with the actual wireframe comps, I have this sitemap that I can constantly reference. It's taped to the side of my monitor on my corkboard. And what that does is it just gives me a context for each page I'm looking at. Nothing's more frustrating than opening up a PDF and clicking 1, 2, 3 and seeing, okay, and often this happens with PDF wireframes, is you'll have one wireframe of, say, an about page, then you'll have one wireframe of the exact same thing, but with an error status. And nothing's more kind of disjoining than just looking through a 30-page wireframe document and seeing a bunch of error statuses and not knowing how pages really fit together. So this really helps just kind of give you a bigger picture. So I think it's very important. And I think it's something you should kind of bolt on to the PDF deliverable. But this, I think, is the most important point in terms of how it impacts the design process. Use real content early. And this is very much related to engaging content strategy. Because we're not really positioning boxes. We're designing content. So it's really important that the earliest stage we can get real content. Even when you're sketching out low-fidelity wireframes, make sure you focus on the actual text you expect to be in the site. And you can be creative. You can make it up. You can really, really have a lot of liberty with it. But you should never use Latin. This can get really scary. Or that Newspeak stuff. I used to use that, the kind of buzzword generator stuff, the ePlur, the corporate speak, Web 2.0 generator. I have one of those. It'll generate a bunch of buzzwords, basically. But that stuff doesn't work, so you want to get it away. It's really bad. That was the tackiest Keynote transition I could find. I tried really hard to find one that was tackier. That was it. The reason it's bad is because it's not real. If you put this stuff in there, you may be blocking out text, and you may have a mental note of what that is, but it's going to be the wrong shape. It's going to be the wrong size. The line lengths are going to be wrong. And it's going to pose a lot of problems for a designer when you actually crack that open. Real content is disgusting. It's ugly. It's the wrong shape. It's the wrong line length. It'll spill out of the frame. It's nothing but edge cases. It's a bucket of edge cases. So when as designers and information architects, we plan on expecting a certain level of consistency because we're using fake content, that lorem ipsum content all has that same shape. That will inevitably screw you in the design process. You will not be able to rescue that comp because it will just make you go back to the drawing board. So here's an example of that. Let's just say we have a box, and it's a box for an address card, and it's a fixed width box. So the bounds of those boxes are going to impact the layout of the site. And in it, we have a name, John Smith, and he has an address and a city, and that works fine for our comp. But what happens when we take that same box and we put in a name that isn't fun? Isn't fun to use. It's a long name, you know? This is something that we just don't expect as designers. And this actually was one of the most eye-opening things for me when I worked for for Catalyst, the web company. I made an entire refresh, an entire redesign of one of our biggest products, and I never tested it with real content. Or rather, I tested it with real content, but only one use case, with someone with a short name, because it looked better. And that just poses so many problems for the process. So once an IA scopes something like this, a fixed width thing with a certain size affordance font, you're going to run into a problem. And that problem is that the layout isn't going to work. And when the layout doesn't work, you create a new problem. How do you have to shorten that? How do you have to account for that? Can you not put the name there? Do you have to change the shape of that? And when you present these problems to the designer without exposing them, I feel like you're not doing your job, because those elements really impact the way that designers work. And what happened, this is a very, very easy example. I'll get to some better ones. But it can really, really, really stall the design process. You have to go back to the drawing board. It can affect scope, because you may get to a situation where you've built an entire interface for something, and you have 3 new interfaces to do, and the thing has to launch tomorrow. So it's really bad to get in that situation. Video is always fun to talk about. So when you think about video, you have to think about ratios. The ratios are never right in video, because there are always multiple ratios. So, well, I wouldn't say always. There are some new sites where you can count on the best video, but most of the time you're doing with a mix. So there are 2 ratios for video. There's 4:3, 16:9, and those ratios matter to the layout of a design. Because when you plan for one and you have to have the other, you have to figure out some way to account for it. So photography is another big one. It's almost rarely square. Unless you're shooting some really awesome Hasselblad and you're shooting 6x6, like perfect slides and everything like that, you're never going to get square pictures. Because almost all digital cameras shoot 4:3, they shoot 2:3, some shoot 16:9, but no one shoots square. But in many cases on the internet, we scope out square images. It's a design pattern. The Gravatar is an awesome example of this. It's 48:48. And how do we get that into a design? So if you have a square box like this, it's going to need an UI solution. When you have a user uploaded content and you upload a 3:2 image and it needs to be square, are you going to do that automatically and trust that it works? Or are you going to have to present the user an option? And when you do this, or when you don't do this, when you assume that square content is readily available, you don't scope out an interface like this. And then the designer has to run with this and paste something together to make this work. Harass a developer to throw this thing together in jQuery, or harangue you again as an information architecture to get back on doing this. So it's really important that we think about these edge cases, not as edge cases, but as just the reality of working with content. Again, treat everything as an edge case. Assume that everything will go horribly wrong, because in my experience, it always does. And as an information architect, I think it's your job to make sure these things are scoped out fully. So wireframe defensively, and make sure that you plan for these types of issues with photography, with video, and with user content, and not working with Latin. So another thing, we talked about this briefly, but it's always good, I think, to work from rough to polished. You never want to go into a design at the hi-fi level of a wireframe. I think that always gets you into problems, because you're not coming up with enough creative solutions. You're not coming up with enough ideas. You're really just starting to just dive straight in to a design. So always work on the spectrum of audio fidelity. Go from low to high. And this is, again, a low fidelity wireframe, a little bit more sketched out. And as we see here, we'll get into a higher fidelity wireframe. So the best thing about low fidelity wireframes is that they keep the ideas flowing. And that's why I think you should stay there as long as possible. I think that trying to move information architecture along too fast can be really damaging to the process. That's why I think it's good to have designers involved in that process, rather than putting them at the end. If you engage them right away, it'll make the process much stronger. You'll have two heads working instead of just one. You'll be able to come up with more ideas, and you'll prevent against this issue where you have interfaces that are left unscoped. And when you work in high fidelity wireframes, you tend to lock in your decisions as the process progresses. So, on a related note, and this is one thing that I kind of have a problem with, is don't be precious with wireframes. As I said in the beginning, I think they're documents. And that's all. I mean, they're PDFs. They represent a lot of thinking, but the thinking is important and not the PDF. I've worked in a couple teams where the PDFs become, I think, a little bit more important than they should be in the process. They're treated as something the client needs to see and needs to review and needs to take seriously as an end result. But really, the only thing that matters to me is the end result of the website. I was at South by Southwest this week, and Chris Fahey, the principal of behavior, had this awesome quote. He did a talk on wireframing, and he said that deliverables are for the design team, not for the client. And I think what he means by that is exactly what I'm saying, which is really don't think of these things as client deliverables. Think of these things as process documents that make your work stronger. But he also adds, make your client part of the design team. And what he means by that, I think, is keep the process open and fluid. Bring your client into this process as early as possible so that they can understand that a wireframe is more than just a PDF with some lines on it, and it's actually the process of you thinking about it and discussing it. So his slides might be up at some point, but it was a really good talk. So never be afraid to go back to lo-fi. This was an issue I had actually with the Visit Mix project, because I got stuck. I got into a dead end on design, and I kept myself in Photoshop. I kept banging my head against comps that were going nowhere. I mean, they looked horrible. They were just, and the more I tried, the worse they got. You know, I was starting to regress, back to being 14. I was going to start making that Windows hotkeys font on everything. I could feel myself just falling apart. And it was because I wasn't getting out. I wasn't backing up and just thinking hey, I'm literally flogging a dead horse. I have to go back and just sketch out some ideas, which is what I did. And that helped move the process forward. I went in an entirely different direction, threw out all my comps, and came up with what eventually is the design that you see up there today. And then along those lines, don't use colors and don't use fonts. And the one amendment I'd put to that is with color, you can use color to show hyperlinks. You can use color to show error states. But use one color and try and make it very, very purposeful in how it relates to the wireframe. In terms of fonts, try to just stick to one. Helvetica looks really nice. I like seeing it. But anything works. It really doesn't matter. I think if you do introduce fonts, you can kind of add a lot of noise to that deliverable that you don't want to add. And the other thing to do is plan for change. Plan the process around change. Don't assume that when you hand off a deliverable, it's done. You want to encourage the designer to modify the information architecture. And this is, again, what Nishant did on our project that was so amazing, because he let me know what I could change, but he also let me know what I couldn't. He controlled the input that I had on these designs. So he put up a color code across the top of each wireframe. I mean, this is dead simple. It's not rocket science. I mean, Nishant's smart, but this is not something that is incredibly complicated to do, but it helps so much with how I perceive the wireframe. So what he said is a color code across the top of each wireframe indicates a confidence level with that wireframe and how it will carry over to the next phase. So when I saw a green comp, I knew that I had to respect this document. And when I saw an orange or a yellow comp, I knew I had to address this document as something that I had agency over. So this really helped my process, just knowing what I could affect and what I couldn't affect. So another thing, and this is kind kind of an interesting topic. I don't want to go too far into it because it's a little technical. But I think that if you're working on a web application or anything that has a lot of interaction design, you should use HTML prototypes if you can. If you have the development team to support it, if you have the resources to support it, it's so helpful because it gets the process into something that is interactive. And you can do a lot of things with HTML prototypes that you really can't do with PDFs unless you're crazy tricky with OmniGraffle, and I feel like that's kind of weird. I think HTML is much, much easier to use. So this is what an HTML prototype looks like. Again, it looks just like a wireframe, and that's the point. You don't want to introduce any style. You don't want to be precious about it. You don't want to care about it. You just want to make it something that people can see, use, and interact with. And the client will see this. And my experience with HTML prototypes is clients really, really love this because they get to see the flow of a site. And I actually don't. I haven't worked on a project in a while that's been this specific to an interface, something like this. But just making click-through wireframes of even my design comps helps immensely with getting people to understand the flow of how a site is going to fit together. So they really show a great flow. And they're also easy to create. I mean, that maybe doesn't look easy to create, but if you have a web team that's capable of this stuff, there's so many tools out there right now to do rapid template generation. You can even use something like Dreamweaver or Expression Web or I believe there's another tool. Or you can just use a CSS framework. There are many CSS frameworks that do such great work at letting you throw together a quick layout. So that's one thing. They're very, very quick to create if you have the right team. But again, things they do is they reveal interaction. And this allows you to show people how the interface is going to behave and how it interacts with your customers and with your users. It also improves team communication because it's much easier for non-design members to see this. They get to see the flow, and they also get to see how it fits together. But designers, someone like me, will be able to see all the views I have to create. Whereas in a static document, a lot of times some wireframes won't be scoped, won't be comped. They'll kind of be left up to me. I've had that happen a couple times. You don't get a full wireframe set, so you kind of have to ad-lib a couple designs. But in an HTML prototype, usually you'll be able to scope those out because the navigation will depend on it. So you get to see a much more complete view of the project. Probably one of the biggest things, and this is something that I don't want to get too deep into, but it allows user testing. And I don't know if anyone's read Steve Krug's new book. Anybody? It's not rocket surgery. But it's awesome. It completely opened my mind to this idea of user testing. And I think user testing is valuable when it's done early. So if you can do user testing on an HTML prototype that has just enough fidelity to get people through it, you can make sure to clear out these big problems, these glaring omissions. You don't have the right button there. You don't have a way to contact. You can watch people stumble through an interface in a way that you can't when they look at a PDF. Oh yeah, that looks awesome, But if you stare at them clicking on the wrong button and you're just wanting to backseat mouse drive them, that's what user testing is. It lets you see the glaring errors up front. And in my mind, they're easier to maintain for large projects. If you have a good development team, you can abstract away a lot of these. This repetition in them in a way that you can't in an HTML prototype. I mean, if you're really good with OmniGraffle or Visio, you can actually make repeatable, master slides and master templates. But I still think that HTML is a much more fluid medium to use. And that's mainly because I have more experience with it, but also because I think with the tools that are out now, it's just so easy to build a very lightweight framework for just displaying interaction in a way that I think it's too cumbersome to do it in a wireframe. And also, you may have more team resources to do that. And the last thing is it engages the development team. We've talked about IA, we've talked about content strategy, but we haven't talked about the programmers. And they deserve love too. So it's important that if you can implement an HTML prototype, that you do. Because that will engage them in the process, and they'll be able to also communicate their expertise as to what will work, what won't work, what will increase scope, what will change the whole thing. So a couple more things I think are really cool to just kind of expand the reach of your position as an IA and working with a designer. And this is what I touched on earlier. Consider yourself a content strategist. Don't limit yourself to being an information architecture in the sense of someone who sketches out layouts and boxes and functional wireframes. Think of someone who's going a little bit deeper and looking into content strategy. I know there's a little bit of a turf war between the two disciplines, or at least I've heard something like that. But I think, again, just keeping your mind open to both positions is really important. And you want to be able to work with a content strategist. But you also want to think, how can I incorporate those ideas into my work? Because content and IA are really becoming a very similar discipline. I don't think you can really address IA without addressing copy, and vice versa. So it's really important to start thinking of yourself as more than just an information architecture. And again, they're mostly the same thing. This is a really big topic at South by Southwest. There were a number of panels this year, about 5 panels, whereas last year I don't think I remember a single one. So I think this is a growing trend that content strategy is becoming much more integral to what we think of as information architecture work. And then just a couple other things. I don't mean to say this preachy, but it's very helpful to learn design fundamentals, just like it is for a designer to learn how to do IA. So some things you can learn, just basics of a grid system layout, just learning about affordance and placement, spacings, gutter, white space. There's never an issue where you can know too much. So I think if you can find the time to expand your abilities, being an information architect who can design is a very useful trait. It'll help you communicate with designers. It'll help you inform your work a lot stronger. Learn a little bit about fonts. Again, I don't think fonts are essential to a wireframing process, but learn about affordance, learn about how making fonts larger, smaller, and how their shape affect the way that a design will hold together. And hold the door open, be a good critic, and attend design meetings. And you want to do this just because you want to show goodwill to the design team that you're willing to work with them on these issues. Because I think it's really important that since we're all part of the same design, same design flow and the same design process, that we all work together to solve these issues. The work is still always live until it's out. So I look at every project as something that is never complete until the website ships. So one last thing, avoid taking things personally. This comes, again, to that idea of not being precious. A lot of times, and I've done this, I think it all comes down to explanation. If you're an IA and you submit work to a designer and they change it drastically, don't immediately say that you're stepping over into the wrong field, but say something more along the lines of, why did you make that choice? Why did you engage with my IA in a way I didn't expect? I want to know your thinking. I want to know why you thought that was right. And you can be confrontational in a soft way rather than a dogmatic way, and you can keep the process open and keep that dialogue going. And I think everything really with design is about outcomes and not roles. So we can be content strategists, we can be information architects or visual designers, but at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is making good work. So the more we can kind of soften these walls and reach across the aisle in a political way, I think the better. So anyway, let's get into something fun. MIX Online. So again, this is a project that Tiff and I did with Nishant and the Microsoft team at Visit Mix. It was about a 2-week design project, but probably about a month and a half long end-to-end design project, including information architecture. So what changed? And this is interesting. So this actually is my final design on the left that I grabbed from the site earlier this week. And on the right, that's Nishant's wireframe. So if you notice, they look almost identical. This was a wireframe that was given a green code. So I knew that these were good choices. I knew that Nishant cared about this. I knew that the team was invested in it. I knew they were making choices. Even if they didn't explain them fully, I knew that there were reasons for things being here. And after I looked over this thing, I understood this makes sense. It made sense to me intuitively as a designer. So I went and transferred this into the art direction that I had worked on. And if you notice, there's a huge parity. The home button is in the same spot. All the navigation is the same. Even the upper links, the main call-out, image placeholder is very similar. The block of text describing what the site is about, recent writings, both in a column, the labs on the right. Just about everything is the same, but there's a couple notable differences. So right there, that's not in the wireframe. And this came out of a discussion that I had with the team where we decided that aside from having that upper navigation, the site needed more context to these links, because these links were separate sections in the site. So we had articles and opinions, we had mixed labs, and we had event speaking. And they're all content on the site, but they're all very different. So it was really important for me to make sure that these had a little bit more writing behind them. And Tiffany worked on this to help me kind of block these out in a much more engaging way. And I made sure that these hit states were enormous. If you click on the site, I mean, it's kind of hilarious. The entire thing just lights up. So it's really good and really interactive, and it really draws people into this. So this is something that, again, that was something that I kind of improvised on and added to this comp, but it made sense, and it was something that came out of a client discussion. There's another thing that happened. The recent comment section, I just dropped it. And I dropped it because as I built this design, I realized that kind of a thread wasn't going to be helpful. We had a lot of noise already, a lot of information, a lot of things to scope out. And putting this recent comments flow, because we'd have to excerpt, and again, this is another issue where if we had used real content, it would have shown kind of this issue that we were going to have where excerpted comments, the idea is smart. You want to show in a lively discussion, but the issue is when you actually put those in, and I actually started like typing in comments, what happened was they just didn't make any sense. Someone starts out responding to someone, you have no idea what they're talking about. You know, some comments are terrible, some comments are annoying, some comments are inflammatory. You just don't want that kind of thing on your homepage, detracting attention from the real information. And what we realized was that the style of having that little bubble on the right exposing the comment number was more than enough to get people to click through and engage with those articles. So here's another design. This was a yellow, I believe, which kind of indicated a medium satisfaction with the layout. And I completely changed it. If you look at Nishant's design, it's 3 columns. Mine's 2 with a modified internal grid. And many of the content choices have been rearranged. Most of the content is the same because Nishant knocked out all the required information, but the positioning, layout, and texture of it is all different. So I did this because we realized that the main thing that was important was presenting the team as a whole, presenting this team as a group of intelligent, strong writers. So what we did was we put these great illustrations that Gabe Ustel, a contract illustrator, had done for the team. We put them together in this pattern that kind of almost made it like a band portrait. And that kind of created this visual block that I thought was really strong. And it also linked them up to the contributors. And one of the issues I had with Nishant's comp was we kind of separated the team for the contributors. And I didn't like that. I wanted these things to be together. I wanted to show that the contributors were related to the MIX team. So putting those things together was really important. And then also the copy. I thought the most important part of the copy was the main message. We're an opinionated group of designers and developers. That was new copy that Tiff and I worked on together to put up there to really kind of introduce this team as a smart group of writers, designers, and developers. So that really helped kind of set the stage for the rest of this design. So it looks like I'm running out of time, and I'm going to skip these couple slides because this kind of just goes over a couple things that these are other project issues I had. But I just kind of want to summarize everything and just give a couple minutes for questions. I really hope somebody has something to say about this. So in summary, context is vital. It's important to use real content as early as possible. It's very, very important to work from rough to polished, to not be precious with wireframes, to plan for change, and to use HTML prototypes if you can. Consider yourself a content strategist and expose and learn from design fundamentals. Hold the door open and avoid taking things personally. Don't be precious. Be passionate with your work because we're all involved in design together, even the dudes with the blue hats. So, thank you guys. So just before I go to questions, Lifecycle of a Wireframe with Nick Fink has been rescheduled to 3 to 4 p.m. Breakers D. He's an awesome guy. Definitely a panel worth checking out. So if you guys feel like you want to go to that, please do. But I would love to have some questions. We have about 7 minutes or 6 minutes. Does anybody have anything? Sir? You can use the mic if you'd like to, too.
Have you worked on a project where you did IA and visual design? And
Yeah.
If so, how did you work this kind of process in when you're the only person doing both sides of that?
That's actually a really interesting question. So how would I work this process in if I was doing both roles? And for a good part of my career, I was always doing both roles. And the issue is tricky because, honestly, I find it hard to separate the two. And it's very important, I think, in a design process to have that role broken apart just a little bit. So it is really tricky. What I would try to do and what I would try to say to that is to try to stay away from getting into Photoshop as long as possible, to stay in a rough wireframe phase, to talk with others, to kind of expand that process as much as possible. If you're working by yourself, just try and keep yourself from committing until you've really explored all your options. Sir?
So I'm kind of wondering about the design process here in Scrum. So,
Of Scrum?
Yeah, so because we're working with more of an agile process these days, a faster cadence.
Sure.
And especially with, say, something like the Windows mobile phone coming up. If you want to keep an app in, let's say, Apple's App Store, you need to be refreshing the app about every 2 to 4 weeks. Pump out a new version.
Sure.
And even in enterprise software, now we're looking at a Scrum of maybe 2 to 4 weeks, same thing. So I'm kind of wondering how do you integrate the designer into that process where everything needs to go on concurrently?
Well, I think that's a really good question. So how do you integrate the design and interaction design process together in a Scrum setting? So Scrum being the agile software development process where you're constantly iterating. And I think the answer is you just make sure to engage both disciplines. To get information architectures and designers into the same room and working on the same problem as soon as possible. You want to make sure that they know, I think at that point, actually, you'd actually want to engage the developers as well. I think it'd be very important to engage developers in that because they're going to also be able to let the design team know what elements are easy to change and what elements aren't. I think it just has to be a much more integrated process if you're going to move that fast. And I think that the thing with Scrum too is it means many different things to many different people. So some Scrum is very, very, very agile, and it's almost all kind of developer focused. And then some Scrum is is a little bit more lenient towards design. So I think it just kind of the more you can integrate all the disciplines in a Scrum process, I think the better. Sir?
I'm a technical architect. I think I have a similar question. I'm just wondering how you think the wireframe design process and the technical architecture design process influence one another, if you think they should.
Okay. So let me just understand the question. How the technical wireframe process can inform?
How the wireframe design process and how the technical architecture process influence one another, and if you think they should. I always think, I always think as much cross-discipline knowledge as possible is the best, because if you're in information architecture and you're making choices that are going to affect the development team, you have to know their limitations. If you're going to scope out an enormous interface that they can't build, I think you're going to get into a lot of trouble. So I think the biggest thing to do is to make sure that you coordinate with the development team as an information architect or a designer and know the limitations of the software. But I do think that information architects and designers should have kind of a much stronger role in leading the direction of a project. And I think if you don't engage them, and you engage them only on a level of style or organization, you're going to end up with a much weaker project. So. Sir?
You've kind of covered this a little already, but do you have any advice for developers when they're engaging in this process?
I think the issue with developers engaging the design process is to engage it early, is to open the door to communication and to talk up front before the project has really kicked off with the design team, and let them know architecture limitations, let them know what kind of timelines your team will need to work with. Everything we talk about with process ends up addressing scope and timelines. So I think it's very important that you engage that the developers engage the designers to let them know, okay, I need a schedule from you as to when your designs can be ready to kind of let me enable that process. I think that's pretty. Okay. And one last question.
I think that more and more now we have, especially with Ajax and etc. So the page itself, they're becoming more and more interactive within the same page.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's becoming a bigger. I work in an agency, so I see that becoming a bigger problem to define how the interaction should work within each page. Because now just lay out in the wireframes, okay, here's where the content goes, is one thing in terms of information architecture.
Mm-hmm.
But the user experience, how you define that, how the page is going to behave within the same page, depending on what the user is doing, I think it's becoming more complex. That actually I was even expecting to see some work done in that sense.
Sure.
How you define interaction within the same page.
Yes, I think that's an issue where it's really only appropriate to use HTML prototypes or some prototype system. I think that using traditional paper wireframes become really difficult because to really show what you mentioned, kind of like an Ajax interaction level design, you really have to show that as it's going to be in the actual application. Even if it's not styled or perfect, or even if it's very rough, you just want to show that whole interaction in the medium that it's going to be exposed in. So if you're making an iPhone app, I would say it's very difficult to wireframe that for too long, and that you are going to have to get into the situation where you start building even a rough prototype of the site to start showing that click-through model. Because if you don't do that, I think you are going to run into what you say, which is like a bunch of unscoped interface questions. So again, I think it is important to kind of make sure you scope or make sure you do rough wireframes up front, but I think it is really important that you make sure to get into an actual prototype phase as quickly as possible. So, okay. Thank you. Okay, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much.